Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, Perfect Building Maintenance, M&T Bank, Customers Bank, Marks Paneth LLP, Ariel Property Advisors, Sterling National Bank, Capital One Bank, Collins Building Services, Meridian Capital Group. Additional support has been provided by grants from AVR Realty Company, Amarant Bank, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, B6 Real Estate Advisors, Briarwood Organization, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Chase Commercial Mortgage, Citizens Bank, CPEX Real Estate Services, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handler Properties LLC, Handler Real Estate, Hodges Ward Elliott INC, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Matone Group, New Banks, Newmark Knight Frank, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rockefeller Group, Rosewood Realty Services, SJP Properties, Stonehenge NYC, TD Bank, Terra CRG, the Merengoff Family Foundation, and these friends. Vienna, 10 weeks old, come over to America on the last ship. The Bronx, Music and Arts School. City College, lots of jobs at City College, even working at John's Bargain Store. Bachelor's, master's, going on a PhD. Mount Sinai, then another, Dr. David Lehr. Volunteer police force. Community leader, Larry Hogue on the West Side. I have Lisa Lehr today. Thanks for being here.
Delighted to be here.
We have a great picture of your mother and your grandmother when you were a child in Vienna. Tell me about Vienna.
My parents were married in 1934. I was a late life baby because each parent, as was the want at the time, had to take care of their parent. So they got married later. My mother was 43 years old when I was born. My father was 53. They did very well. They were middle-class merchants in Vienna. And
they were in the butcher business, right?
Yes. They had a large family butcher store, a Fleischhackerei, Fleischhauer.
Right, and we have a picture of your mother being in the butcher shop.
Yes, and her nephew, my mother's brother, owned all the stores. Maximilian Max was his name.
So what happens? Your mother and father realize it's dangerous for Jews to be in Vienna because at that time, Vienna wasn't even called Austria. It was called Vienna, Germany.
Correct.
Over there. So they get on the last ship, but the rest of the family stayed in Vienna.
And disappeared. I have no relatives.
Your mother or father had somebody in the Bronx who signed for them?
My father had a sister who lived in the Bronx and was not very well off, but she lived in the Bronx, and her husband had a job, so they got an affidavit.
And that was the way that you came in, and we have the picture of the green card of you over there. So they come in. And as you said to me, your father and mother's skills were limited because it was the butcher business over there. And it was a difficult time. It's 1938.
1938.
Okay. And basically, they couldn't find anything. They were lucky to even have a place to live.
Well, my women, those days, especially in this culture, didn't work. So my father was supposed to support the family. He was 53 years old, spoke no English, and had no American skills.
So fortunately for the HIAS, Hebrew Immigration Society, and other charitable things,
exactly.
This is how your family survived at the beginning.
My family survived, and at the age of 14, I remember I first lied about my age because I had to support my aging and non-English speaking parents, so I got jobs.
Right, but you went to school when you were 4, okay, right?
5.
5, and you went in, and you didn't speak too much English at
I
that
did
time.
by the time I was 6.
Right, and then you won a spelling bee, I remember.
Yes, when I was 8 years old, I won the New York City Spelling Bee, in English, not in German. Yes.
Now, how did you decide to go to music and art?
Well, I didn't want to go to the local school, which was not very good, even in those days. It was in a part of the Bronx that was not as safe. And I had a talent. I drew, I painted very well, and I brought my portfolio in, and I was accepted as an art major.
So you're music and art over there, you're supporting your family, and you graduate from music and art at 17, right?
Right.
So at 17, you go to City College?
Across the street.
Okay, so let's talk about, when you were at City College, you had basically 3 jobs that you were working
3.
on. So let's talk about the 3 jobs.
Well, I worked in the office, also lying about my age, at a prestigious university downtown. I typed very fast. Then I went...
Which was the prestigious university downtown?
NYU, on the square.
Okay, so you had NYU on one of the jobs.
Yes. Then I had John's Bargain Store, and I forgot the name of the second one, but oh yes, and I had a job on Saturdays. On Saturdays,
right, with the hickory smoked ham.
I wore an abbreviated costume. I was cute, you know, and I wore an abbreviated costume like the cigarette girls with black net stockings and high heels, and I gave out samples of ham on Shabbos.
Right.
Great, but I spoke to God and He permitted it.
Now, when you were at City College and
I was the cashier in the snack bar.
Let's talk about the cashier in the snack bar, because later on in life you run into one of the people you were in the snack bar.
One of the gentlemen who came in, one of the students, was in ROTC in the uniform, and he came in every afternoon.
He was a thin guy, you said. He was...
Oh, he was adorable, but he was my age. When he came in, I was 17, so he was 17. And he worked with the Pershing rifles, which was part of the ROTC, and he had all these ropes around his shoulder because indicated his status and his proficiency. And I was the cashier in the snack bar, and every afternoon at about 4:30 he came in with and he said, "Strawberry malted ma'am." And I was the ma'am, and he...
Right, but you said to me you put a little extra scoop in.
Yes, but I wasn't supposed to do that. I went behind the counter.
Statute of limitations are over, so...
I went behind the counter. I put so much ice cream into that the malted machine wouldn't mix.
So even though we're going to go back to your life at that time, let's fast forward about 50 years later that you run into...
Well, much more. It was last June.
So it's 2018.
Yes.
Okay.
And this was 1958.
1958. You're at the Stryker Center at Temple Emmanuel, right?
Yes.
And what happens?
And there the speaker is the same gentleman who got the strawberry malted, and it was now former Secretary of State and General Colin Powell.
So what happens? You go up?
I was in tears, and I think he was very touched. As the picture was taken, I had a ticket for a strawberry malted at the local malt shop, and he said he would go immediately.
Interesting story. So let's go back.
A wonderful man.
Okay, so let's go back to 1958. You were going for what type of degree, your bachelor's?
I was going for my bachelor's, and I had to go to a bachelor's in education and ed psych because I had to work to support my parents.
Right, so one of the jobs that you were a substitute teacher, right?
In the Bronx.
In the Bronx. And that was for how long, about a year?
For 2 years.
2 years.
My vocabulary changed.
Okay, and after the substitute teacher, you're going for your master's now.
No, I had my master's in 1 year. I got my bachelor's in 1959 and my master's in 60.
So then you were going for your PhD?
I was going for my PhD, and my father died.
You said to me he smoked, what, 80 cigarettes?
My father smoked 4 packs of Camels a day. I grew up in a yellow haze. And he died at Mount Sinai of lung cancer, which was not surprising but devastating. And it meant that I had to now become the sole support of my mother. So I had to stop the doctoral program at Columbia University, and I needed a job. And one of my side jobs was I was the assistant house mother, so to speak, at that age, at International House. And I couldn't continue because I needed a good job. So somebody said, there is an opening at Mount Sinai Hospital. And I went over and I was interviewed by Dr. Hans Popper, the Nobel pathologist, liver pathologist.
Who basically ran the morgue.
Yes. And I was in charge, I was the administrator of the morgue. And there were stories that I can tell, but not on it. Anyway, and...
So what happens one auspicious day, you're at Mount Sinai, you hear about a job not too far away?
I hear about a job 6 blocks up at Flower Fifth Avenue Hospital. And I heard about it because my former superior, Dr. Fred Zach, called me and he said to me, Liesel, that's Lisa diminutive, my colleague Dr. David Lehr needs an administrator and you'd be fine. Leave Mount Sinai. So I said, it's my lunch hour. So I ran up in my lunch hour and I walked in and there was David Lehr.
So who was David Lehr at this time? He was 25
chairman,
years old.
30 years
30 years older than you. He's chairman of the pathology department.
No, pharmacology and physiology. At that time, I was 22 and he was 52.
But he was the head of, this was New York Medical College and Flower Fifth
That's
Hospital.
correct. And when I walked in, it was magical. Rainbows appeared, birds sang. It was a cataclysmic event, and he looked at me and I looked at him. It was like Brigadoon. We just...
Now, you realized he was also from Vienna.
Well, of course.
Okay, so you, as they would say, you were Landsman.
Not only were we Landsman, but I was engaged to a very nice young man at the time. I was wearing his engagement ring, a fellow I had met at City College. But when I saw Dr. Lehr, I was stricken by the fact that that's what God intended me to do. I had come home. We spoke the same language, ate the same food, laughed at the same jokes. It was magical.
So let's speak a little bit about David, and then we're going to go back to your life. Tell me about David, because David wrote a book dedicated to you. Mm-hmm. The book was called what?
Vienna before and after the Anschluss. So
let's talk about David coming over from Vienna, because it was really difficult for him to come over.
Very
difficult. I read most of the book.
Came through Sweden. He had a girlfriend in Sweden who invited him to lecture at Karolinska Institute. And he did, and from there he got a job in New York because he wanted to bring what was left of his family over. So he came to Flower Fifth Avenue Hospital.
When did David come over to?
1939.
So he came over later than your parents. Okay.
Yes.
So he came over in 1939.
The day that I was born in Vienna was the day that David left Vienna. I caught him 30 years later.
Right, so he comes over and he wrote this book talking about the travels and the tribulations of the period of time. And it was dedicated. When did David write the book?
In 1995. He was 85.
Okay, so you go to work, in addition to falling in love to David, you go to work at Flower Fifth.
17 years.
Beginning in 1960...
65.
65 to 1982.
Right.
Okay. Let's talk about David, because part of it relates to David's compassion for the community. Let's talk about his award. He was nominated for Nobel
Prize for his work in sulfonamides. And these were these little packets, apparently, of white powder that the GIs in World War II had in their kits in case they were wounded. Sulfur drugs. And, of course, that was later eclipsed by the penicillins.
You and David get married, okay? You're working side by side with him. And at that time, you were living in New Jersey.
Montclair.
Montclair, New Jersey. And then you just say, I want to go to the West Side. But the West Side had certain problems.
It was the building I had lived in before I was married. I loved my neighborhood. And when I came there, I felt very guilty because I had pulled my husband out of a wonderful place in Montclair, suburbia. The street was quiet, green, there were squirrels and raccoons, and we had a pool, and there was a tennis court, and it was gorgeous. I was very unhappy. I'm a New Yorker, and nothing happened there.
So what happens? The West Side was really in shambles.
The Wild West.
It was the Wild West.
Yes.
What was happening? The Larry Ho, your campaign to institutionalize this individual.
What happened was, well, he had been institutionalized 48 or 49 times, but each time he got out because after the crack cleared, he was okay the next day, and then they had to let him go. And there was no follow-up because there was no law to require the reinstitutionalization of mentally ill crack addicts who don't take their medication.
What type of campaign did you foster on the Upper West Side?
I think I base it on something about the European, the Viennese culture, and I'll translate it, of course, but there is a saying for the Viennese, das lasst man sich nicht gefallen, which means one doesn't tolerate that. So if there is an impediment to your happiness, you do something about it. So the first thing I did is I decided that I had to work with the police to do something. And I joined the Auxiliary Police Program as a raw cadet in 1987. I rose through the ranks, but in the meantime, the police were wonderful. And everybody got together. Then I recruited politicians, the newspapers, The Spirit, the New York Times, Leslie Stahl, 60 Minutes. And there was really a campaign for the reinstitutionalization of mentally ill crack addicts. And everybody got together. And finally, I seem to have, and I'm trying not to brag, but I seem to have finally been the person who said, enough, you know, we can't go on like this. He tried to push a child, and pushed several children onto the tracks. People pulled them up before the train came. Pushed one in front of a moving truck. The truck stopped. But we lived in terror. He roamed the streets, and the problem was that he had been very briefly, maybe several days in boot camp, and I think they had sent him to Guantanamo Bay as a young man. And when he was there, it was obvious that he was very troubled, and from what I understand, he tried to burn the barracks down. So they discharged him. And therefore, because they had taken him in and recruited him, he got a pension. Mm. And the pension was used only for crack.
Now, what was the Lehr law?
They finally, I don't know whether it's still on the books, but the law was for the reinstitutionalization of mentally ill crack addicts. Something we had been trying for years, and we met with everyone, and politicians came in. And then there was one politician who was very helpful. His name was Rudolph Giuliani. And he became involved in that, and of course used this in his campaign about what's happening in the streets, and it was a disaster at that time, and things got much better.
Now, didn't you work for you were involved with his campaign or his administration, right?
I was head at the time of Democrats, which I am, for Giuliani on the West Side. And there were a lot of closet Giuliani voters among our devoutly Democratic Upper West Side.
Let's talk about the police force.
Yes.
What you've done, because today you are lieutenant.
I'm deputy inspector.
Deputy inspector, which is like the #2 ranking.
Mm-hmm. Our jurisdiction, Patrol Borough Manhattan North, goes from 57th Street in Manhattan, both sides of the park, east and west, to Spuyten Duyvil. Our jurisdiction, at least Manhattan North, ends where the 50th precinct begins. That's on the other side. That's the Bronx, you know, where you go over the bridge, over the Spuyten Duyvil, the Broadway Bridge.
So people don't know, what is the role and the responsibilities of the volunteer?
We're the eyes and ears of the police department. We do what they do, but we don't carry guns, and we work in conjunction with our superiors, the police. The regular uniformed cops. We're uniformed too, but it's a different uniform.
And how often do you work?
I am there every Tuesday and Thursday from roughly 2 until 10.
Now, are you at a specific location, or do you go to different places?
I really am not supposed to talk about
No,
our
no.
placement. Yes, no, our area is Patrol Borough Manhattan North. And we work basically with the other 13 precincts that it comprises. In other words, it comprises everything from 57th Street up, the 19th precinct, the 20th Central Park precinct, the 24th precinct, the 23rd on the east side, and it goes every precinct up to the last precinct we have is the 34th precinct in Inwood.
Now, how'd David take this, that you joined the volunteers?
Absolutely loved it. And my husband was very funny. He used to say he's in bed with the police. Then he said he sleeps in the arms of the law. And finally, they did something wonderful. They gave him an honorary uniform with a badge. Only the problem was I outranked him.
So besides the police, you've been very involved in the community on the West Side. Talk to me a little bit about.
Well, you know, it started with Larry Hogue, with the Wild Man of 96th Street, and it ended at 3 o'clock this morning. It's amazing.
What happened at 3 o'clock this morning?
Because I did a lot of gardening when we had the house in Montclair, I recognized, and it was recognized the day before by Adrian Benaby, the former Parks Commissioner, that kids and teenagers and dogs were looking and sniffing around a tree that had a bush that had grown up just in front of my house. And I thought, oh my God, that's ginseng weed, and if it's ingested, it's fatal. So I spent the morning calling the Parks Department, the Environmental Protection Department, the Poison Control Center. And at this moment, I think they're removing it, but it's being covered by, I think, the New York Times.
Let's talk about David after he retired, or he never really retired.
Never really retired.
Okay, he may have retired from New York Medical College over there. When was he the Nobel Prize?
He was nominated for the Nobel Prize posthumously, and of course that doesn't happen. His colleagues nominated him, his scientific colleagues, but they found that it couldn't be done. You know, he had just died, and...
He died at what?
He died at 101.
Right. We have a picture of you with him at 90. We have a picture of you of him at 100, and he died at 101. We have a picture of that.
It was a wonderful marriage.
Okay. Now, you did something to endow David's memory.
I did after David's death. I was very poor, and suddenly I wasn't very poor. And I was a 72-year-old widow. And so I took David's money and I did good things with it.
So let's talk about some of the good things you did with the money.
The first thing was an ambulance, a Hutzola ambulance for Riverdale, which of course works all over the city, but it's primarily situated in Riverdale. And that was basically a full-service MASH unit that still serves Riverdale. And I dedicated it to David, and that at the time was a cost of $190,000.
What about the program for research students?
And then I decided, I spoke to some of David's former doctoral candidates who are now established in Washington and all over in medical circles around the country, and they decided what Dr. Lehr would really like is to have the money go to research. So I called his favorite organization aspect, the American Society for Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics, and I endowed with my husband's money, which was now mine, but my husband's money, I had none, the David Lehr Award for excellence in research in saving human lives by therapeutic pharmacology, drugs and treatments.
So there's one winner a year?
There is one winner every 2 years.
Every 2.
And I have a significant other, a lovely man, also a just retired physician, a neurologist, Dr. Michael Brand, wonderful man. And we just came back from Orlando, Florida, where I presented the third David Lehr Award, because there have now been 3 two-year periods since it started. And the winner of the last award was very touching to us. And I remember we both sat there, Mike and I can't vouch for Max, but I had tears in my eyes, because the research that the second recipient did was wonderful research, and it's now being tested and worked on, and his contribution was beginning to find a cure for pancreatic cancer.
What a wonderful thing.
A wonderful thing. There I go. And I looked up and I said to David, you happy?
Speaking of that, you, as you said to me when we got together, every week you try to visit David's.
I go every week.
Every week you go to New Jersey, right?
Yes. Cedar Park, Bethel.
Cedar Park, Bethel. And you have a bench.
Oh, yes.
You have a bench.
I have a bench. It's a moon bench. And I sit there and I tell David everything that happened and what progress is being made. And occasionally there's a tree there and some birds come over, and I think the Canadian geese must think I'm nuts because they come listen to me talking to my husband. It's very bucolic and it's lovely.
So, you know, it's nice and very fortuitous that your father had a relative in the Bronx, that you came over.
Aunt Elsie.
Aunt Elsie, and that you've been helping, you've been a community leader. You and David have helped the community, and thanks for being here today.
You're welcome.